Every U.S. president eventually dies, but the way history explains it may be too innocent. Clean, polite, even peaceful. Some presidents fell to assassins, while others survived the bullet but not their doctor's treatment. And a few died in ways so weird they sound made up. So today, we're breaking down how every U.S. president actually died. Let's start with the man on the quarter and the $1 bill, George Washington. In 1799, the former president developed a severe throat infection after riding horseback in cold, snowy weather. Today, this would be treated with antibiotics and rest. Back then, doctors believed illness was caused by imbalanced humors, meaning the body had too much blood, bile, or other fluids. So they did what made sense to them. They drained his blood. Over just a few days, Washington's doctors removed nearly 40% of his total blood volume. They blistered his throat, forced him to vomit, and administered enemas. As his airways swelled shut, he became weaker with every treatment. America's first president died at 67 at his Mount Vernon estate, leaving a young nation to mourn. He wasn't defeated by disease. He was medically overtreated to death. And tragically, this kind of outcome wasn't rare. Take John Adams, who lived to be 90 years old, which in the early 1800s was almost unheard of. Adams essentially outlived his entire generation, and despite his age, he wasn't bedridden for years. By most accounts, he remained mentally sharp and physically functional until just months before the end. On July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years after signing the Declaration of Independence, Adams suffered a fatal heart attack. This wasn't a slow fade from old age, but a relatively sudden collapse after a short decline. But the timing wasn't just historic, it was personal. For years, Adams had been exchanging letters with Thomas Jefferson. After decades as allies, enemies, and rivals, the two had reconciled late in life as long-distance philosophers, writing about politics, regret, and the strange experiment they helped start. Neither man knew the other was dying. On July 3rd, Jefferson, already gravely ill, reportedly asked a simple question: is it the 4th? When told no, he rested through the night. He died around noon the next day, on Independence Day. Thomas Jefferson died at age 83, likely from complications related to chronic illness and multiple organ failure. Jefferson had been sick for months, but he was holding on, intentionally or not, for a date that mattered. Hours later, in Massachusetts, John Adams died, unaware Jefferson was already gone. Two founding fathers, former presidents, dead on the same day, on America's birthday, 50 years after creating the nation. And this wasn't just poetic history, it was a reminder that early presidents lived without modern medical support. When decline began, there was little anyone could do to stop it. The pattern nearly continued with James Madison. Madison, the shortest president at 5'4" and the primary architect of the Constitution, was gravely ill in June of 1836. He suffered from congestive heart failure, where the heart can no longer pump blood effectively, causing fluid to build up throughout the body and gradual suffocation. As Madison lay dying, his doctor offered to prolong his life so he could die on July 4th, joining Adams and Jefferson in what was becoming a strange national coincidence. Madison refused. He reportedly said he would not consent to unnecessary treatment just to die on a symbolic date. 6 days later, on June 28, 1836, James Madison died at age 85, just 6 days before Independence Day. Then came James Monroe, who completed the pattern anyway. Monroe had struggled for years with tuberculosis, a slow and debilitating disease that damaged his lungs and weakened his heart. By the end of his life, he was frail and dependent on care. On July 4, 1831, James Monroe died at age 73, becoming the third U.S. president to die on Independence Day. At that point, it stopped feeling like a coincidence and started feeling like a curse, at least to people living through it. By the mid-1800s, medicine wasn't the only problem. The White House itself had become dangerous. Not because of politics, but because of water. Washington, D.C. had primitive sewage systems, open drains, and little understanding of sanitation. Human waste routinely drained into areas upstream from where drinking water was collected. Germ theory didn't exist yet, so no one realized the same water keeping presidents alive was quietly poisoning them. And no president illustrates this better than William Henry Harrison. Harrison famously gave a nearly 2-hour inaugural speech in cold, rainy weather without a coat or gloves. For over a century, history blamed his death on pneumonia, but modern medical analysis suggests that explanation doesn't hold up. Harrison didn't become sick immediately. He fell ill weeks later, which doesn't match exposure-related pneumonia. What does match is typhoid fever or septic shock, both commonly spread through contaminated drinking water. In other words, Harrison probably didn't die from the weather. He died from the White House's plumbing. Just 31 days into office, the 9th president was gone. Still the shortest presidency in U.S. history. Harrison was 68 years old. That elevated John Tyler, a man who was never particularly healthy to begin with, and who quickly earned the nickname His Accidency. He suffered from recurring digestive problems and chronic illness throughout his life, long before medical records were standardized enough to say exactly what. After leaving office, Tyler didn't quietly retire from politics. During the Civil War, he sided with the Confederacy, a decision that effectively erased him from the official presidential legacy. When Tyler died in 1862, he suffered a fatal stroke at the age of 71. Because he had aligned himself with the Confederate government, Tyler remains the only U.S. president not buried under the American flag. His coffin was instead draped with the Confederate flag. Even in death, he managed to break presidential tradition. Then came James K. Polk, a president who didn't just burn the candle at both ends. He treated the presidency like a controlled demolition. Polk believed the job should be completely all-consuming, and he meant that literally. He worked extreme hours, rarely slept, kept no real social life, and often skipped meals. He also promised to serve only one term, which meant he tried to cram an entire presidency's worth of work into 4 years. And it worked, politically. Polk accomplished nearly every major goal he set, expanding U.S. territory dramatically and reshaping the country's borders. But physically, he paid for it. By the time he left office, Polk was visibly thinner, exhausted, and already unwell. Just 3 months later, while traveling through the southern United States, Polk contracted cholera, a waterborne disease that causes rapid dehydration through severe diarrhea and vomiting. In the mid-1800s, cholera outbreaks were brutal, killing up to half of those infected, sometimes within days. Polk didn't last long. At just 53 years old, James K. Polk died, giving him the shortest post-presidency lifespan in U.S. history, a record he still holds. Then there's Zachary Taylor, a career military general who survived decades of combat, harsh climates, and battlefield disease, only to be undone by a snack. On a scorching 4th of July in 1850, Taylor attended public celebrations in Washington, D.C. Trying to cool off afterward, he reportedly ate a large quantity of raw cherries and washed them down with cold milk. Within days, he was violently ill. Food safety in the mid-1800s was almost non-existent. Milk spoiled quickly, fruit was often unwashed, and refrigeration wasn't a thing. Combined with contaminated water, this was a perfect recipe for acute gastroenteritis, possibly dysentery or cholera. Taylor died on July 9th, just 5 days after the celebration, at the age of 65. Because the nation was deeply divided over slavery at the time, rumors spread that Taylor had been poisoned for political reasons. More than a century later, his body was exhumed and tested. No poison was found. After surviving wars and becoming president, Zachary Taylor most likely died from bad food and bad water, which unfortunately was incredibly normal for the time. After all of that, Millard Fillmore almost feels out of place. Fillmore took office after Taylor's sudden death and managed to avoid most of the health disasters that plagued his predecessors. He didn't drink heavily, didn't smoke, and lived a comparatively moderate lifestyle. which for a mid-1800s president already put him ahead of the curve. He survived his presidency, lived through the Civil War, and even saw the country begin to modernize in ways earlier presidents never imagined. No mysterious illnesses, no bad food headlines, no assassination attempts. Eventually, in 1874, Fillmore suffered a stroke, a fairly common cause of death at the time, especially as people lived longer. He died at the age of 74, making him one of the earlier presidents to reach what could be considered an old age for the 19th century. In a lineup full of strange endings, Millard Fillmore's death was notable for one reason: it was almost normal. Let's start with the most famous assassination of all, Abraham Lincoln. In April of 1865, just days after the Civil War ended, Lincoln was shot at point-blank range at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth. The bullet entered the back of his head, destroying massive portions of his brain. Lincoln immediately fell into a coma and died several hours later at age 56. He was never going to survive, but what happened next still matters. Doctors crowded around Lincoln, probing the wound with ungloved fingers in a desperate attempt to locate the bullet. This added pressure and contamination to an already catastrophic injury. It didn't change the outcome, but it perfectly captured the state of 19th century medicine. And Lincoln wouldn't be the last president where doctors made things worse. That brings us to James A. Garfield. In 1881, Garfield was shot twice by Charles Guiteau at a train station in Washington, D.C. One bullet grazed his arm, the other entered his back, but crucially, it didn't hit any major organs. By modern standards, Garfield should have lived. Instead, doctors repeatedly inserted unsterilized fingers and instruments deep into the wound, widening it as they searched for the bullet. They turned a survivable injury into a slow, massive infection. For 80 days, Garfield suffered from fever, abscesses, and sepsis. The bullet didn't kill him, the infection did. Even Guiteau later claimed he didn't kill the president. The doctors did. James A. Garfield died at age 49. Then came William McKinley, the third assassinated president. In 1901, McKinley was shot twice in the abdomen at a public event in Buffalo by anarchist Leon Czolgosz. One bullet caused minimal damage, the other penetrated his stomach. Doctors believed they had successfully treated him. McKinley even appeared to be recovering, but the bullet was never found, and deep inside, the tissue began to die. Days later, gangrene set in. McKinley died 8 days after being shot at age 58, not from blood loss, but from infection caused by internal tissue death. This time, the nation finally took notice. McKinley's death directly led to the Secret Service being permanently assigned to protect the president, ending the era of casual public access and unguarded handshakes. And then there's John F. Kennedy, the one everyone thinks they know. In 1963, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, but what history often skips is that Kennedy's own medical history played a role. He suffered from chronic back pain and wore a rigid back brace under his suit. After the first bullet struck, that brace kept him upright, preventing him from collapsing forward and potentially avoiding the fatal second shot. John F. Kennedy died at age 46. By the early 1900s, assassinations were no longer the biggest threat to the presidency. The real killer was stress. Add in cigarettes, alcohol, terrible sleep, and the weight of running a country, and the job itself became a slow medical experiment. Take Theodore Roosevelt. Despite surviving a gunshot wound to the chest during a 1912 campaign speech, and finishing the speech anyway, Roosevelt didn't escape unscathed. Years of extreme physical exertion, dangerous expeditions, and untreated infections weakened his body. In 1919, Roosevelt died in his sleep at age 60 from a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that traveled to his lungs. A vice president later joked that death had to take him while he slept, because if Roosevelt were awake, there would have been a fight. Then there's William Howard Taft, whose presidency took a serious toll on his health. Taft weighed over 300 pounds at his heaviest, suffered from chronic high blood pressure, and experienced heart disease for years. He eventually died at age 72 in 1930 from complications related to cardiovascular disease. Not from being stuck in a bathtub, but from a heart that had simply been overworked for too long. But no presidency better illustrates the cost of power than Franklin D. Roosevelt. By the time FDR ran for his fourth term, his health was collapsing. He had severe high blood pressure, heart disease, chronic lung problems, and the lingering effects of polio, all hidden from the public. In April of 1945, while posing for a portrait, Roosevelt suddenly complained of an intense headache. Moments later, he collapsed from a massive brain hemorrhage. He died in office at age 63, exhausted by war, stress, and a body that had been failing for years. Some presidents didn't collapse suddenly, they faded slowly. Dwight D. Eisenhower survived multiple heart attacks while in office, thanks to modern medical intervention. Earlier in his life, he had smoked as many as 4 packs of cigarettes a day. But he quit cold turkey in 1949, years before becoming president. Still, the damage was already done. Decades of strain on his heart eventually caught up with him. And Eisenhower died in 1969 from heart failure, not because medicine failed, but because it could only delay the inevitable. Dwight D. Eisenhower died at age 78. Then there's Lyndon B. Johnson. LBJ lived under relentless political pressure while pushing through some of the most consequential legislation in American history. In 1955, he suffered a massive heart attack that forced him to quit smoking while he was still climbing the political ladder. But after leaving the White House in 1969, Johnson returned to old habits, reportedly smoking up to 3 packs a day. In 1973, at just 64 years old, Lyndon B. Johnson suffered a fatal heart attack at his Texas ranch, ending a life defined by intensity, ambition, and exhaustion. Ronald Reagan's story was different, not sudden, but slow. Reagan survived an assassination attempt, served 2 full terms, and lived to age 93. But the final decade of his life was defined by Alzheimer's disease, a gradual loss of memory, identity, and independence. As the disease progressed, Reagan withdrew from public life, and in 2004, he died from pneumonia, a common and often fatal complication in patients with advanced neurological decline. By this point, the pattern was clear. Presidents were no longer dying because medicine failed. They were dying because the human body has limits, and power doesn't raise those limits, it tests them. Which brings us to the final question. After centuries of disease, bad medicine, assassins, and stress, have modern presidents finally beaten the odds? Not really. They just changed the rules. Less dying from doctors, more dying from time. Not every president went out with a headline, but the ones we've covered explain the toll. Which death caught you off guard? The Lincoln-JFK coincidences? All documented. But some coincidences don't explain history. They defy it. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit like, subscribe, and stick around.